Let's get one thing straight. Hollywood loves to rewrite history, especially when there's a cowboy hat and a six-shooter involved. Most westerns serve up fantasy, clean boots, impossible shootouts, and towns so spotless you'd think they were assembled yesterday. But what if I told you there are westerns that actually sweat the details, get their hands dirty, and let you smell the dust in desperation? How many true westerns have you actually seen? Stick around, because these 17 movies prove that sometimes the real story is wilder than the myth. Meeks Cut Off 2010. If you've ever thought the Old West was all about shootouts and gold, Meeks Cut Off is here to rub your face in the sand, literally. This isn't a movie that flatters the audience. It dares you to sit with the women, the wagons, and the bone-dry boredom of the real Oregon Trail, based on a true disaster in 1845, when a blustering guide named Stephen Meek led a wagon train into the heart of nowhere. This film doesn't skip the ugly details. People don't just get lost, they starve, they turn on each other, and they question whether hope is worth the wait. Director Kelly Reichardt strips away the Hollywood varnish. No sweeping music, no heroic speeches. Instead, you get the blinding sun, endless plains, and the gnawing tension that comes when everyone's faith starts to crack. Forget wide, postcard landscapes. This film boxes you in, using the same cramped aspect ratio as vintage westerns to trap you right alongside the doomed travelers. Every bonnet is accurate, every dress dirtied by dust, because, for once, nobody cared if the actresses' faces were hidden. It's a level of commitment that would make most studios nervous, and for good reason, Meeks Cut Off isn't interested in your comfort. Roger Ebert called it the first movie to actually show what wagon trains endured, and he wasn't exaggerating. By the end, you'll feel like you made the journey yourself, and you won't be sure you'd survive it either. The Missing 2003. You want a Hollywood Western that shoves you right into the grit, fear, and heartbreak of the old frontier? Ron Howard's The Missing skips the campfire songs and goes straight for the throat. Set in New Mexico in 1885, this film drags you into the merciless reality of frontier life, where the line between civilization and chaos is razor thin, and every day is a struggle against something hungry, whether it's the wilderness, your neighbors, or your own past. Cate Blanchett leads as a tough, no-nonsense rancher and healer, raising two daughters on the edge of nowhere. When her oldest is kidnapped by a brutal outlaw who traffics girls, she's forced to team up with her estranged father, Tommy Lee Jones, an outcast who's gone native and walks between worlds, never quite belonging anywhere. Howard and his team didn't mess around with the details. The costumes are battered, sun-bleached, and stained. The medicine, the tools, the food, all dead on. The Apaches aren't just background or one-dimensional villains. There's a real effort to capture indigenous customs, spirituality, and language, with much of the dialogue delivered in Apache and every ritual treated with gravity, not Hollywood hokum. The violence isn't stylish, it's messy, sudden, and often gut-churning. There's no hero moment, no rousing score to tell you what to feel, just fear, panic, and exhaustion, as mother and daughter track the gang across mountains and deserts that look as unforgiving as the day God made them. The Missing never shies away from showing just how vulnerable people, especially women, were on the fringes of civilized America. Even the good guys are flawed, broken by their secrets, regrets, and mistakes. Critics praise Blanchett and Jones for their raw, lived-in performances, and called out Howard for refusing to sugarcoat the uglier parts of Western history. If you want the myth, look elsewhere. But if you're ready for a Hollywood Western that sweats the details, honors the fear, and leaves you wrung out by the final frame, The Missing delivers the real deal, straight, no chaser. The Hired Hand, 1971. You want to see the Hollywood cowboy myth shot full of holes? The Hired Hand is your slow-burning wake-up call. Directed by Peter Fonda, just after the counterculture tidal wave of Easy Rider, this film didn't ride into town with a bang. It sort of wandered in, muddy boots, quiet stare, and a handful of honest intentions. The story is almost aggressively unglamorous. A drifter named Harry returns home to the wife and ranch he abandoned years before, hoping for forgiveness, or at least a place to sleep. But his wife isn't handing out redemption like candy. Instead, she hires him as a laborer. And that's it. No big showdowns, no high noon gunfights, just real people trying to patch over scars with work, silence, and a little bit of hope. What makes The Hired Hand feel so real isn't just its story, it's the way the film breathes. Cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond bathes everything in dusty sunlight and shadows, making the West look less like a painting and more like a world you'd actually have to live in, day after aching day. The costumes are work-worn, the tools practical, and the dialogue unvarnished. Universal Pictures thought they'd get another rebellious hit, but when Fonda delivered a quiet meditation on guilt and second chances, the studio panicked. They dumped it in barely 50 theaters, didn't bother to advertise, and watched it sink. But the fans who found it, they never let go. Martin Scorsese picked it for his first Tribeca Film Festival, and Clint Eastwood credits its grit as a major influence on Unforgiven. It's not for everyone, but if you want to feel the real aches of frontier life, the way loneliness gnaws at you, the way forgiveness is harder than gunplay, then The Hired Hand is about as honest as Westerns get. Don't expect a happy ending. Expect the truth. Ozanas Raid, 1972. Forget what you think you know about cavalry and Apaches. Ozanas Raid throws the playbook out the window and hands you a cold, hard slab of reality. Burt Lancaster leads a ragtag cavalry patrol chasing an Apache raiding party across the brutal, unforgiving Southwest. The mission? Relentless, dangerous, and exhausting. The film isn't about glory or heroism. It's about survival, mistakes, and the simple fact that most U.S. soldiers were always 2 steps behind the people who actually knew the land. Director Robert Aldrich doesn't sugarcoat a thing. Fort Lowell is recreated right down to the last weathered board, and the baseball game on the parade ground isn't just a quirky detail. It's a slice of real history, borrowed straight from the diaries of men who lived there. Every frame drips with authenticity. The cavalry aren't iron-jawed heroes. They're worn down, confused, and often scared, trying to outthink an enemy who's always ahead of them. Even the Lock Scouts, Apache allies working with the Army, are given rare complexity and respect, something nearly unheard of in earlier Westerns. Lancaster was so obsessed with the project, he took a cut of the profits instead of a paycheck, and even had a hand in the editing room. The result? One of the most relentlessly bleak, realistic, and morally complex Westerns of the 1970s. Critics loved its honesty, but audiences weren't always ready for a film where the lines between good and bad were this blurred. Ozanas Raid isn't interested in making you feel comfortable. It's here to show you how harsh, messy, and human frontier warfare actually was. If you walk away unsettled, that's exactly the point. The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, 1982. If you're sick of Westerns that turn every non-white character into a stereotype or a prop, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez is the antidote. Based on a true story that tore through Texas in 1901, the film follows Gregorio Cortez, a Mexican farmer who ends up on the run after a single tragic misunderstanding with law enforcement explodes into a deadly manhunt. What sets this film apart isn't just its accuracy with costumes or set design, which are both spot on. It's the way it captures the confusion, the cultural collision, and the quiet desperation that shaped real lives. Edward James Olmos is flawless as Cortez, channeling a man hunted not just by posse, but by translation errors and the grinding wheels of an alien legal system. The film nails the language barriers. English, Spanish, and mistranslation all swirl into a deadly storm where one word can mean life or death. The chase itself, 11 days, 450 miles, 600 men, feels less like a Hollywood set piece and more like an exhausting ordeal you can feel in your bones. The style is so naturalistic it nearly slips into documentary territory, refusing to exaggerate or play for melodrama. Cortez's story became the stuff of legend, told in songs and books, but here it's stripped of myth and given its full, complicated weight. No cheap heroics, no easy villains, just a real man caught in a system built to misunderstand him. When it comes to realism and raw emotional power, the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez rides at the front of the pack. Dead Man, 1995. You ever see a Western that feels like a fever dream and a history lesson rolled into one? Dead Man is that rare beast, a black and white odyssey through the lawless, industrializing West that's as accurate as it is bizarre. Jim Jarmusch doesn't care about your Western expectations. Instead, he plunges you into a world where outlaws, cannibal bounty hunters, and indigenous guides all collide on the edge of civilization's rot. Johnny Depp's William Blake is less gunslinger and more lost poet, wandering through a landscape that's as lethal as it is poetic. What makes Dead Man historically honest isn't just the worn-out guns or the grime-streaked faces. It's the acknowledgement of how industrialization bulldozed native lands and ripped apart old ways of living. But don't expect a lesson wrapped in nostalgia. The film's surreal moments and existential rambles only make the brutality feel sharper. The weapons are period accurate, the violence is ugly, and every town is one bad day away from vanishing into myth. Gary Farmer's performance as Nobody, an indigenous character with depth and humor, stands out as a rare piece of real representation in westerns. No noble savage cliches here. The film bombed at the box office and baffled critics. Roger Ebert called it strange, slow, unrewarding. But here's the punchline. Dead Man gets closer to the spirit of the West, its danger, its weirdness, its relentless change, than most movies ever dare. Watch it and you'll see. Sometimes, truth is stranger than fiction. Geronimo, 1993. When Hollywood takes on the story of Geronimo, it usually fumbles the details or cranks up the heroics. Not this time. Walter Hill's Geronimo. An American Legend is one of the few westerns that actually gets its hands dirty with the facts. Instead of just another whitewashed epic, Hill brings in Apache advisors and consults with historians to make sure every village, every uniform, every battle feels lived in and real. The costumes, painstakingly researched. The cavalry drills, so spot-on even reenactors had to admit it felt authentic. And for once, the Apache characters aren't just background. They're complex, conflicted, and fully human. Production designer Joe Olves built villages from the ground up, and costume designer Dan Moore refused to cut corners. This is a movie where the landscape and the people feel inseparable, harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving. But here's the real tragedy. 5 days before its theatrical release, TNT dropped its own TV version of Geronimo, blasting the story to millions before Hill's film could even get a running start. The result? Geronimo tanked at the box office, earning barely half its budget back. But don't let the numbers fool you. This is one of the most rigorous, honest depictions of the Apache Wars you'll find. If you're tired of Hollywood's old cliches, this film is the palate cleanser you didn't know you needed. Ride with the Devil, 1999. If you think Civil War movies are all about generals and grand speeches, Ride with the Devil is here to scrape off the sepia tone and drop you straight into the mud. Ang Lee's take on the guerrilla violence that tore up Missouri during the Civil War is more anthropology than Hollywood epic. No sweeping heroics or tidy resolutions, just raw, complicated humanity. The attention to detail is obsessive. Uniforms look like they were pulled out of a soldier's bedroll, guns jam at the worst possible moments, and the language sounds like it was borrowed from the diaries of real bushwhackers. Even the actors, Tobey Maguire, Skeet Ulrich, Jeffrey Wright, are aged and weathered until they blend into the period. Lee refuses to take sides or hand you easy answers. Every character, from pro-slavery raiders to freedmen fighting for their lives, is treated with nuance and respect. There's even a rare, honest portrayal of black characters and German immigrants, two groups usually shoved out of the frame in classic westerns. Ride with the Devil doesn't just tell you the Civil War was hell. It makes you feel it. One muddy, nerve-wracking skirmish at a time. Critics raved about its realism, but audiences stayed away, maybe because the truth hurts a little more than myth. If you want the Civil War without the Hollywood polish, this film is a revelation. The Alamo, 2004. Let's be clear, most movies about the Alamo are as reliable as a cowboy's poker face, long on legend, short on fact. But John Lee Hancock's The Alamo isn't just another patriotic cartoon. It goes all in on the details, starting with the timeline and even nailing the ages of the historical figures. Travis at 26, Bowie at 40, Crockett at 50. Disney dumped a fortune into building a 51-acre set, creating the largest and most historically accurate Western town North America had ever seen. Costumes, weapons, accents, they all pass the sniff test. But accuracy here means more than just props. It's about dread, confusion, and the raw, ugly suspense of men waiting to die. The battle scenes are visceral, loud, chaotic, and quick, just like the real showdown that lasted less than 20 minutes. Hancock refuses to serve up easy heroics or one-dimensional villains. Santa Anna's forces are disciplined, relentless, and terrifying. The defenders aren't marble statues but flawed men reckoning with their choices. Critics, of course, roasted it for being too bleak and too historically dense. The film lost a jaw-dropping $146 million and holds a pitiful 29% on Rotten Tomatoes. But that's Hollywood for you. Accuracy rarely pays. Still, Roger Ebert saw through the noise, praising its sense of impending doom and the lonely courage at the heart of the real story. If you want a version of the Alamo that's closer to reality than any schoolbook, this is the one to watch. Don't expect a myth. Expect a slow, hard stare at the cost of legend. The Homesman, 2014. Most Westerns dodge the subject of mental health like it's a snake in a bedroll, but The Homesman stares it down with clear eyes and steady hands. Adapted from a novel by Glendon Swarthout, the same guy who wrote The Shootist, this isn't your standard shoot-'em-up. Instead, you get a haunting journey across the barren Nebraska frontier, with Hilary Swank playing a lonely, driven woman tasked with transporting 3 mentally ill women back east. Tommy Lee Jones directs and stars as a washed-up drifter who reluctantly signs on to help, and together they cross a landscape that's as dangerous as it is empty. Here, accuracy isn't just window dressing, it's woven into every detail. The wagons creak, the clothing is battered and practical, and the isolation of the endless prairie creeps into every frame. The film pulls no punches about how the West treated its most vulnerable, no comforting nostalgia, just the harsh reality that not everyone who made it out West was built to survive it. Mental illness isn't played for melodrama or dismissed, it's front and center, a reminder that frontier life could break a person as easily as a gunfight. The result is a Western that feels honest, grounded, and sometimes uncomfortable in its realism. It's not a feel-good ride, but it's a ride that'll stick with you, and maybe even change the way you look at the heroic Old West. Open Range 2003. If you're waiting for a Hollywood Western to finally get cattle driving right, you don't have to look any further than Open Range. Kevin Costner's film ditches the usual frontier theatrics and goes for the kind of lived-in, mud-under-the-fingernails realism that most Westerns are afraid of. Forget shiny spurs and glamour shots. These cowboys slog through rain, mud, and the kind of loneliness that eats at you from the inside out. The cattle actually look like they belong on a 19th century prairie, and every campfire scene feels like it was plucked from a history book instead of a soundstage. But Open Range isn't just about visual authenticity. It's about emotional truth. Costner and Robert Duvall play men who are tough, sure, but also tired and wary, shaped by years of hard living and harder choices. The violence, when it comes, isn't slick or choreographed. It's sudden, brutal, and loud, over in seconds, but with consequences that linger. Even the town, with its crooked main street and wary citizens, feels real, like a place you might stumble into if you took a wrong turn on a dusty road. Critics loved the film's attention to detail, and even old-school Western fans tipped their hats to its honesty. If you want to know what the Open Range really felt like, how much of it was boredom, how much was fear, and how much was plain hard work, this is the movie that finally got it right. Dances with Wolves, 1990. Forget the snarky jokes about Kevin Costner and his 3-hour epic. Dances with Wolves is a Western that finally dared to take the Lakota point of view seriously. It's easy to dismiss the film's sweeping romance and Oscar night dominance, but go back and look at the bones of it. This is a movie obsessed with accuracy, from the dialect coaches who worked with every actor to the recreation of daily life on the plains. Costner could have played it safe and made another John Wayne fantasy, but instead, he hired native actors for native roles and gave the Lakota Language Center stage. No more broken English, no more one-dimensional chief characters. Here, the Sioux are depicted with complexity, pride, and humor. The buffalo hunt wasn't staged with CGI or props. It involved real herds, careful choreography, and months of planning. Costumes, tools, even the food. If it didn't exist in 1863, it didn't show up on screen. The U.S. Army isn't portrayed as faceless evil, but as a bewildered, sometimes sympathetic bureaucracy, caught between manifest destiny and the chaos of the frontier. Costner's Lieutenant Dunbar is no superhero. He's a man lost, learning, and humbled by the reality around him. Was every detail perfect? No. But compared to the cowboy and Indian cliches that came before, Dances with Wolves was a revelation. It rewrote what audiences thought a Western could be and set a new bar for historical realism, proving you can still fill theaters and win Oscars when you treat history with respect. McCabe and Mrs Miller, 1971. Robert Altman didn't just want to make a Western. He wanted to drag you into a world so raw and lived in that you'd swear you could smell the wet wool and hear the boots squelching in mud. McCabe and Mrs Miller is a Western for people who are sick of white hat versus black hat fairy tales. Set in a barely there mining town in the Pacific Northwest, the film oozes authenticity from every frame. Costumes are shabby, weather-beaten, and real. The saloon is a smoky, ramshackle mess. The townsfolk aren't outlaws or heroes. They're desperate strivers, gamblers, and outcasts, all trying to survive a place that feels like it was hammered together yesterday. Altman's camera roams and lingers, never giving you an easy, polished shot. Dialogue overlaps and mumbles. Nobody's pausing for dramatic effect, because in this town, everyone's too busy hustling for warmth and whiskey. The love story at the center, between Warren Beatty's gambler and Julie Christie's brothel madam, is as muddy and complicated as the town itself. When violence finally arrives, it's sudden, sloppy, and more terrifying than any choreographed showdown. Critics and filmmakers, Tarantino included, have praised McCabe and Mrs Miller as one of the most authentic Westerns ever shot. It's not a comfort film. It's a reminder that the real frontier was more squalor than splendor, and that sometimes the American dream was just staying alive another week. Little Big Man, 1970. Most Westerns love to talk about the good guys and the bad guys. Little Big Man laughs at that idea, flips the script, and hands you a wild, contradictory mess that feels a lot like the real 19th century West. This isn't just Dustin Hoffman in a wig, it's a full-blown assault on the myths that built Hollywood's version of the frontier. The film follows Jack Crabb, captured and raised by Cheyenne, running with outlaws, fighting at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and bumping into almost every legend the West ever spawned. But underneath the wild adventure is a relentless attention to the messy, often brutal realities of history. Director Arthur Penn didn't shy away from showing the ugliness of white expansion, the forced relocations, the broken treaties, and the atrocities committed against native peoples. The Cheyenne aren't just noble savages or faceless victims. They're complex, funny, and full of life. The cavalry isn't all bad, the native warriors aren't all good, and Jack Crabb himself is a coward, a survivor, and sometimes just a lucky fool. The costumes, sets, and language all push toward a kind of muddy realism that leaves you questioning every myth you grew up with. Little Big Man isn't perfect, but it might be the most honest Western of its era because it's not afraid to admit that the Old West was more confusion and contradiction than clean moral storytelling. Sometimes the truth is more absurd than the legend. Appaloosa, 2008. If you're tired of Westerns that look like they were made in a theme park gift shop, Appaloosa is your palate cleanser. Ed Harris directed and stars in this spare, slow-burning showdown set in a New Mexico town with more dust than charm. But instead of the usual Hollywood flash, Appaloosa sinks deep into the details of frontier law and the real drudgery of keeping order on the ragged edge of civilization. Harris and Viggo Mortensen play lawmen for hire, rolling into Appaloosa to lay down rules in a town where guns, whiskey, and corruption are standard currency. Every handshake feels tense, every glance carries the weight of survival, and every gunfight is quick, ugly, and about as glamorous as a punch in the teeth. The film's realism is everywhere. The way townsfolk are more interested in keeping their heads down than joining a posse, the way alliances shift, and the very real dangers of frontier justice, where lawmen often played judge, jury, and sometimes even the accused. Harris makes sure every hat is battered, every coat is patched, and the dialogue crackles with awkward silences and period slang. The relationship between the two leads, equal parts brotherhood, rivalry, and hard-earned trust, feels lived in and vulnerable, not the stiff heroics of your granddad's westerns. Critics applauded the movie's refusal to sugarcoat or mythologize. It's a film that doesn't care if you're comfortable, just that you believe every mud-splattered minute. By the end, you realize that frontier justice wasn't just fast, it was fragile, and sometimes dangerously personal. Hostiles 2017. A lot of modern westerns want to be gritty. Hostiles doesn't just wear the label, it grinds your nerves raw with the weight of its history. Scott Cooper's revisionist western opens in 1892, with Christian Bale as a haunted army captain, forced to escort a dying Cheyenne chief and his family back to their homeland. The setup isn't just for drama, it's a stage for one of the most brutal, uncompromising portraits of the West in recent memory. Forget the campfire sing-alongs. This is a journey through violence, bigotry, and sorrow, where every step forward means facing the ghosts of genocide, betrayal, and broken promises. What sets Hostiles apart is its absolute refusal to flinch. The violence is shocking, but never cartoonish, and the suffering is constant, but never romanticized. Costumes, weaponry, even the haunted landscapes, they all ooze with period accuracy. The dialogue isn't loaded with wisecracks, but with the grudging, hard-won respect that comes from surviving hell. Native characters aren't background props. They have stories, scars, and real voices. The film's moral ambiguity means nobody escapes clean. Not the soldiers, not the Cheyenne, not even the innocent. Critics noted how Cooper worked with historians and indigenous consultants to get the details right, and it shows. Hostiles isn't a film that comforts. It confronts, and in doing so, maybe, just maybe, it makes us reckon with what the winning of the West really cost. Heaven's Gate, 1980. You've heard the legend. Heaven's Gate nearly killed United Artists, bankrupted its director, and became Hollywood shorthand for expensive disaster. But if you skip the jokes and actually watch the movie, you'll see something rare, a Western so committed to historical detail, it practically becomes a time machine. Michael Cimino's epic dramatizes the Johnson County War, a bloody 1890s conflict in Wyoming between wealthy cattle barons and immigrant settlers. Cimino demanded accuracy to the point of obsession. Costumes were handmade from period fabrics, sets were constructed from original plans, and the extras spent weeks learning how to live, move, and even eat like 19th century immigrants. The scale is insane. There are Harvard graduations, immigrant dances, muddy towns, and vast landscapes that look both gorgeous and grim. Every frame pulses with authenticity, and, yes, a kind of exhaustion that mirrors what real settlers probably felt after months on the trail. The film's original cut ran over 5 hours, but even the shorter versions retain a documentary weight, showing just how messy and brutal class warfare in the West could be. Critics hated it at the time, but the movie's reputation has rebounded. Many now see it as a misunderstood masterpiece, a feverish vision of American ambition and tragedy that refused to compromise. Heaven's Gate isn't easy to watch, but it's as close as cinema gets to showing the raw, beautiful, and blood-soaked truth behind the Western myth. So the next time someone tells you Westerns are just shootouts and swagger, hand them this list and watch their jaw drop. Real history in the West was never clean, never simple, and definitely never boring. Which of these brutally honest Westerns shook you up? Or did we miss your favorite gritty classic? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe for more truth bomb film deep dives, and remember, sometimes the wildest stories are the ones that actually happened.